Let's get some more perspective now on the economic and political context at play from former Bank of Canada Governor Stephen Poloz. He's a special advisor at Osler, and former Finance Minister John Manley, a senior business advisor at Bennett Jones. Hello to both of you. Thank you so much for making the time. I appreciate it. Mr. Manley, I'll start with you. If you were doing your previous job today, what kind of message do you think you primarily want to be sending with this document?
It's going to be a tough one for the minister, I have to say, because of the political context. You have to remember, parliaments come in two phases. The first phase is the first 2 years, and the second phase is the second 2 years. You want to do all the hard stuff in the first 2 years, because in the second 2 years, you're into the pre-election phase, and Parliament becomes more difficult to work with. She's got some real problems to deal with here. She has to deal with clearly the housing shortages, the pressure from the NDP on a pharmacare program, lots of spending requests from other ministers. And at the same time, we're seeing interest rates going up. We're seeing pressure to try to reduce the pressure that the Bank of Canada is having to deal with on inflation. And that means you got to kind of turn back some of the spending. So that's a tough balancing act, and we'll see whether she can pull it off tomorrow.
I'll pick up on a few threads, Mr. Poloz, from Mr. Manley there, primarily around some of the uncertainties where interest rates are concerned. And the other half of that is uncertainty around where growth is headed. Looking at those two things, how uncertain are they?
Well, they're highly uncertain. Vashi, we have so many things happening at the same time in the economy. And so it's impossible really for forecasters to nail those things down and give us a very concrete baseline. So with that context, I think, though, what we need to know is that we need to be prepared, better prepared than we are today for trouble in the future. And we're very far from how prepared we were for the pandemic, because we haven't even got close to working our way back to that point. That's water under the bridge for now, but I think those efforts should be back in form when we see the full economic statement tomorrow. A more explicit attempt to get us closer to that level of preparation that we were in prior to the pandemic.
If I read that right, Mr. Manley, it's along the lines of something that you've talked about before, which is essentially having more to draw from in the event of the next crisis. Clearly, a lot of federal money went towards addressing the pandemic, and there's been a lot of focus on the degree to which the government has unwound or is unwinding from that. From where you sit, when you look ahead to tomorrow's document, does that mean essentially no new massive program spending, no new big announcements?
Well, they're clearly going to have to dress a few things up as new announcements, and I think we're getting some pre-indications about some of the initiatives they want to take in the housing sector. But where we used to build this plan, Vashi, was around the notion that you had a fiscal anchor, and it could. I mean, I never had a zero deficit fetish, if you want to call it that. I mean, we've had different fiscal anchors over the years, sometimes as a percentage of GDP to measure the deficit. Sometimes it's been that the trend has to keep going down. Stephen's predecessor, David Dodge, says you got to keep the portion of government revenues that go to pay the interest on the debt below 10%. There are a variety of things you could do, but I think the feeling since the pandemic came in and then blew all of those away is that there is no fiscal anchor. There's no reference point. And unlike the early pandemic days when the belief was no problem, you can borrow money, interest rates are close to zero, interest rates have shown that they actually do respond when inflationary pressures build up. And governments have to pay those rates. That's the one thing that you pay before you get to anything else in your expenditures is you pay the interest on your accumulated debt. So this is a very challenging time, and I think we're all going to be looking to see whether the minister can articulate some kind of fiscal You can call it fiscal anchor, you can call it fiscal guardrails, you can just call it a reference point, but we've got to know where they stand on continuing to add to the debt burden.
It sounds, at least from the conversations I've had so far, Mr. Poloz, and sort of the communications they've telegraphed thus far, that they will be looking at that debt to GDP or articulating something along those lines as an anchor of sorts. And they often say, look at it compared to other countries in the G7. It is in relatively good standing comparatively, and it's far lower than it was compared to the pandemic when it was at, obviously very high levels. Your thoughts on on that and more generally the importance, if you do see it, of a fiscal anchor?
Sure. Well, the version of a fiscal anchor that's been in the FES and in the budget for the last couple of years has been paying attention to the debt to GDP ratio and ensuring that it's at least declining. And declining by very modest amounts, but at least declining. And that is the minimalist definition of a fiscal anchor that one could bring to the equation. That debt ratio was far higher than it was prior to the pandemic. And we've had an awful lot of really good economic news over the last 3 years. The economy vastly outperformed what we thought it would do back in 2020. And that gave big fiscal dividends. And each time we've had the opportunity to sock that money away, we've found a new program to put in place. With the result that today, the baseline for government spending in the economy is about 2 percentage points higher than it was prior to the pandemic. That's a permanent level increase in the participation in the economy by the government. And what that means is that the private sector in the economy is 2 percentage points smaller than it otherwise would be. We would have more growth in there. And it also means, as we all know, that we kind of goosed the economy during a time when it was already hot. And so regardless of whether you think interest rates have peaked or soon will peak, whatever, the point is that that peak will be higher than it would have been if we had been putting more of that money away for the next rainy day. I understand we got to look at programs. Those are things the government does. They want to achieve things, and that's fine. But the discussion has to happen in a context of making choices, not just doing whatever we want. I think that's really the constraints are starting to show up. That's what I think is the reckoning for tomorrow.
And can I just quickly follow up with you and ask, especially in the context of the bank and monetary policy, you often hear, for example, the finance minister talk about not wanting to counteract or work in the opposite direction. Based on what you've seen so far, what would need to happen tomorrow to ensure that isn't the case?
Well, that's a hard question now, Vashi. It's like a horse that's left the barn because the economy is either in recession or the next best thing. Kind of parts of the economy are in recessions, like we have our head in the oven and our feet in the freezer, hot parts and cold parts. And so on average, it's sort of a sluggish economy, maybe slightly negative, that kind of thing. So judging where fiscal policy should be now is much harder than it was a year or two ago when the economy was clearly doing really, really well. So now I think what we need to do is pay attention when the government says we're making an investment in this. Well, in the FES, it's a perfect opportunity to come back and measure the quality of those investments and let us know how it's going. So childcare is a great example, which we know has boosted labor force participation among young parents. Let's say women in the 30s, women in the 30 age bracket. They've boosted their participation in the workforce by 3 percentage points. That's a lot of new taxpayers, a lot of money coming back to, in effect, pay for that program. So that shows how an investment can work. But I think this is an obvious place to kind of make that distinction between different types of spending. Some of them really pay off for the economy, and other ones don't. And they may as well be clear about which things are working. And those are the things worth doing differently again, or other things that aren't, dropping them, making choices.
Mr. Manley, pardon me, make a choice. Got it. Mr. Manley, last choice of mine is to ask the final question to you. And it's sort of in that vein, because the government has very much behind the scenes signaled to us that this will not be a fiscal update that like the one we've seen in the past few years, which is essentially a little budget, that it will be a slimmer document. We'll just say where things are at. In your assessment, is that a good move based on what we just heard from Mr. Poloz as well?
Oh, well, absolutely. That's what it used to be intended to do. It was really meant to be an update from the budget 6 months or so earlier to say, okay, well, in the budget we expected this much growth. We expected that these would be the costs. This is what we anticipated the interest rate would be. This is what we thought unemployment was going to be. Here's what's actually happening. Here are the adjustments from the budget that we tabled a few months ago. That's what it was meant to be in the first place. I think that to trend back to that is a wise thing, particularly in the current circumstances. It'll give us a little bit of time before the budget in probably February or March, more likely March now, to actually see, have we in fact slipped into a recession? What's going to be required? And the political situation is going to evolve in that time. Need I remind people of what the government's partners, the NDP, said in their convention a few weeks ago, that it was going to be pharmacare or an election. So there's some uncertainties out there, Vashi, and we'll see how it all plays out.
If I recall, it comes with its own hefty price tag, so we shall see. Thank you so much to both of you for making the time tonight. I appreciate your analysis and insights. Stephen Poloz and John Manley.